Why white male leftists are even worse than females currently. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and on October 7th, 2016, I uploaded a video called 7 Reasons the Worst SJWs Are White Women. That was about a year and a half ago, and the video did fairly well, garnering just under 16,000 views. People undoubtedly liked it for a few reasons, most likely because it was funny to them, but more specifically, I think it was probably funny to people not just because I used that crass type of humor so common with people in this sphere of YouTube who drink a lot, which I was at the time, but more so, I think that video was funny to people because it was just so true. 9 times out of 10, when you ran into a crazy far leftist feminist on the internet in 2016, it was a white woman. Back in 2016, white female leftists were so ridiculously obnoxious, self-righteous, condescending, and downright arrogant when it came to discussing their socio-political and half-baked political beliefs, which were generally based entirely around patriarchy theory or just nonsense like shout your abortion. Oh, that will totally age well. They also commonly showed off this nifty new word they learned in 2015 or so called intersectionality, which meant that women get to be in charge of the entire Western world because apparently feminists invented activism or something. Intersectional feminism was the primary motivating force for the entirety of the movement that many people would call social justice. And, unlike the white women who ended up dominating it, the most common and vehement early proponents of intersectional feminism this decade tended to be black women like Mia McKenzie of the blog Black Girl Dangerous. Women like Mia McKenzie and her contemporaries in the intersectional feminist blogosphere were almost unanimously composed of a 3-pronged personal marketing strategy that they hoped would become legitimate careers. They were almost exclusively academics who commonly could flash their credentials on their Wikipedia homepage to sound legitimate as intellectuals. They were almost exclusively writers, of course, who would publish on blogs and often publish books, and they were unanimously activists, whatever that means. Educator, author, activist. Almost every single one of them said that about themselves. However, it didn't take long for the white female establishment feminists to realize during the second half of the Obama years, which, remember, was supposed to be a precursor to the Hillary Clinton years, that being black, like the sacred black president, was every bit as marketable in leftist culture as being female, and thus, everybody had to become intersectional if they wanted a career in this rat race. It was at that point that people like Lindy West, who previously just casually wrote about how much she hates men because they called her fat too often or whatever, ended up shifting gears and talking more about racism and how intersectional she was. Because Lindy West is pretty woke for an upper middle class white girl that's barely ever left the rich neighborhoods of Seattle. After upper-middle-class white female career feminists like Lindy West basically appropriated the label of less publicized authors like Mia McKenzie and started calling themselves intersectional, eventually basically every white female leftist that has access to Facebook followed suit. And let's not even get started about the ones that are on Tumblr. These people read Jezebel and Everyday Feminism, and the mentality multiplied, because if you read those articles and take them seriously, the conclusion that these blogs offered in terms of solving the problem of the white male patriarchy or whatever, generally, it just amounts to a bunch of internet call-outs. That's what they want you to do. Smash the patriarchy, insult people on Facebook and Twitter. Try to get them fired. That's how we'll do it. Now, granted, there's all sorts of intersectionals who will tell you and will have always told you that they didn't think call-outs are usually all that productive, as they feel that this type of public shaming behavior leads to animosity and destroys the positivity within communities. However, that would just be the common sense within each of these people, getting in the way of what their ideology really wanted them to do. Ultimately, at the end of the day, intersectionality was basically no more than a marketing ploy designed to first create a very specific set of rules regarding certain socio-political opinions that you are allowed to have or not allowed to have, and who you could insult freely and who you couldn't insult freely. And then if you violated any of these rules, or even looked like maybe you violated them, you'd be punished on social media, which often ruined people's social lives and or careers. There's a reason why the Wikipedia entry on fourth wave feminism takes a particular note of call-out culture. Now granted, at this point, all of that is old hat to me and most of my subscribers, and I'm just playing catch up for anybody that is still legitimately new to thinking about these types of issues. However, what I do want to reiterate briefly is why I think this mentality ended up catching on so firmly with white women in particular, who always seemed to try to act the wokest of the woke, at least on social media. They probably didn't really have any black friends, but whatever. Long story short, white women had the most to gain as a social demographic by worshiping the gods of intersectional feminism, at least long term. And I think that they all knew it subconsciously by the messages coming from the White House and the Hillary Clinton campaign. While upper-middle-class black women thought briefly while the Black Lives Matter movement was kicking off that maybe they might finally get their time in the spotlight as far-leftist organizers, well, soon enough, people like Lindy West came along and stole their thunder, because apparently body positivity articles get more clicks from people who sit around staring at Facebook all day than articles shaming women for being white. Who would have ever thought? That being said, all through 2016, white women had everything to gain by vehemently defending the status quo in the West, which is, of course, feminism, albeit rebranded deceptively as supposed intersectional feminism, but it's not actually intersectional because it doesn't take into account the fact that males are the ones systemically suffering in the West. But, they wanted to defend the status quo because that's what people do when they're in power. And the status quo had already been on the side of females for well over 2 decades, systemically. This is all obvious if you look at numbers around education, suicide, homelessness, and court bias. And while systemic advantages didn't actually make white women think that they were all that happy, probably because the men in their lives were so miserable, which made them miserable in turn, the systemic imbalance was edging even more towards the favor of women with the advent of Hillary Clinton potentially becoming our president, which they figured they wanted, of course. But eventually, Hillary Clinton lost, and they didn't get their way. And while for a while they cried their eyes out and talked about punching Nazis, as if we are legitimately supposed to believe that Harriet here actually knows how to spot a legitimate white nationalist, and that she would be brave enough to clock one if she did, eventually I see more and more of these white women tiring out. As hard as it might be for some of you to believe, I can assure you, as somebody that does live in a far leftist area and is connected to thousands of people directly on my personal social media network, that I am noticing that although the white women haven't entirely given up on their feminist beliefs, they certainly aren't as aggressive as they were in 2016, and many of them are starting to become open to examining arguments from the men's movement. And black people largely just seem completely tired of feminism, from my observation, because it has never done anything for them, and they largely kinda know it, I think. Truthfully, I would bet that this greater cultural trend of average white women starting to be less sure of themselves and their feminist beliefs is probably mainly a result of them realizing that they've truly lost and starting to deeply examine why that might have been. But maybe even more so, they might simply be scared, because they worry about what happens after they picked a fight that escalated into street violence with the right, but they would probably end up losing if it got worse. You see, women are almost exclusively not fighters, and they rely on men to do the grunt work for almost all of their radical activism. Do you think legitimately that Yvette Falarca would act like she does without at least 20 or 30 loyal males by her side? Of course not. She knows she couldn't fight even the average conservative woman. Female feminists are smart enough to realize what they are up against, and even more so, now that the violent confrontations have happened a few times with groups like Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys, the career feminists and radical female activists might have simply realized that their boys will lose a fight with the other boys 9 times out of 10, and that the other boys more than probably have them outnumbered overall. However, while the female feminists might be losing hope in this battle of the culture war, the male feminists had to be completely indoctrinated in order to be loyal foot soldiers, and there's no great way to deprogram them once their agency has completely been taken away. And that's where the new breed of vehement, completely ridiculous and aggressive white male internet feminists come in, which we notice all the time now. I do, at least. You see, white men never had anything to gain by embracing feminism. Obviously, it was quite the opposite. If a white male went to high school in certain areas and went to university, he was undoubtedly subject to endless cult-like indoctrination, where his professors did their best to reprogram him to hate himself and sacrifice his own comfort in life to basically serve the females and minorities around him as if it was his duty. His job was to compete over who gets to be the best ally to women and racial minorities. Now granted, many and probably even most white males rebelled against this mentality, at least subconsciously, which is why most of them probably sound a lot different when they are alone with each other or playing video games or whatever than when they are hanging out at their university. However, there were a massive amount of white males that were successfully indoctrinated into the cult of intersectionality, and it turns out that they might be the worst of all in terms of their behavior long term. You see, when a black woman endorsed intersectionality in 2013, it was probably easy enough for her to look at her mother and think about all of the hard work that her mother had put in to raise her kids and provide emotional labor to the men around her. Thus, when she started embracing a mentality that put black women on a pedestal, it probably made sense to her because her mother was a great woman. Furthermore, when a white woman embraced intersectionality, she knew it was a quick way to remain teacher's pet for the rest of her life, because it was what the entire establishment wanted out of her. As calling oneself an intersectional feminist was a great get-out-of-bigotry-free card. However, when a white man becomes an intersectional, it's not for any personal gains. Thus, it almost exclusively has to be because he's a legitimate true believer, because again, it does nothing for him. And how can anybody talk him out of what he truly believes? Thus, eventually we got guys like Michael Rowlands, who was willing to go on air with my friend Miss Misa, who is a mixed-race female, telling her for a long while how wrong she is for not understanding how much she is oppressed. Can anybody possibly imagine anything more condescending than that? Some white guy telling a mixed-race female that she's stupid for not knowing she's oppressed? It could only come from white males at this point, and it seems like they are willing to beat this dead horse 6 feet underground, rubbing salts in the wounds of the redundant wounded. And the most ridiculous thing about all of this is that they are wrong about almost everything, and they are fighting to literally be oppressed systemically as white males in the countless ways that the left actively discriminates against them. Everybody else is starting to tell these guys, dude, give it a rest. We'd actually prefer a world that is fair to individuals and values freedom of speech. And their response is basically, shut up, you fascist! I'm gonna punch you if I ever see you! It's been straight white men like these that I used to be friends with who have picked fights with me on the internet, claiming that they will support politicians that I disapprove of simply by virtue of the fact that I disapprove of them, which to them means that it is obviously a candidate fighting for positive intersectional social change. When I mention that this is a ridiculous mentality to have towards somebody, especially somebody that they used to be friends with, they'll tell me that they don't want to be my friend because I am obviously such a misogynist. And then they'll go on to explain that gay men are horrible misogynists because, of course, gay men constantly grope women, according to a straight guy that never spent much time in gay bars anyway. And then, of course, when I say that this claim that gay men constantly grope women at gay bars is untrue, that it's women who usually touch gay men, and that he probably shouldn't be trying to lecture me about what type of environment a gay bar tends to be if he doesn't want to sound homophobic, well, at that point, he'll then say that I am denying the experiences of women, as if he didn't just deny mine. However, there's also white gay men like these who will go on prolonged smear campaigns against me as an individual, spreading public rumors that I am a quote-unquote white supremacist, even though the guy knew me personally when I was in bands with black bandmates, so he theoretically knows that there's no way that I could possibly be a white supremacist, and yet he persists. Now granted, maybe there's something more to it with each of these guys. In fact, I can assure you that the more I think about it, the more there obviously is. The straight white guy who was calling me a misogynist apparently didn't treat his girlfriends all that well, from what I heard from a friend of his baby mama. And the gay guy who's white simply doesn't have any friends that aren't white, so we can assume he's overcompensating to mask his own racism. However, the conclusion tends to be the same. These are white men that are seemingly under the full delusion that even after most everybody has given up on it, intersectional feminist social justice is the religion that will absolve their sins. And if they give themselves enough Hail Marys by throwing other white men under the bus publicly, everything will be all right. And they won't go to white male hell. I guess I'll see them at the pearly gates and see who gets rejected.